All right, it is 5 after the hour, and we're going to get started. Representative O'Neill is having some technical issues, so he may be able to join us later. My name is Ryan Bates. I'm the Executive Director of End Gun Violence Michigan. We're a coalition of 45 faith, parent, student, teacher, and community organizations working together across Michigan to try and make our state safe, make our state safer, and prevent the scourge of gun violence. We're honored to have been working with our coalitions across the state for these past few months to try and advance a series of bills that will protect survivors of domestic violence from the use of guns by abusers. We're here today promoting legislation that was introduced in the House and the Senate 2 weeks ago, and we have some really important perspectives to share. I'll ask folks to keep themselves on mute unless you are actively speaking. I'm going to first introduce from one of our incredible coalition partners, the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence, Cheree Thomas. Cheree?
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for coming here today. As stated, my name is Cheree Thomas. I'm the Deputy Director for the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. The issue of domestic violence is important to me as I've seen its devastation in both my personal and professional life. I know the never-ending nightmare that's left behind when you have lost a loved one to domestic violence and a gun was used. We're here today as part of a day of action called by End Gun Violence Michigan and the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. There are several events taking place all across Michigan today in Detroit, Saginaw, Flint, Royal Oak, Muskegon, Grand Rapids, and Kalamazoo. We represent the state's faith community, students and teachers, gun violence prevention organizations, community groups, women's organizations, and responsible gun owners. 50 women and 20 children are killed by their abusers with guns every year in Michigan. And we're here to say enough's enough. No more. It does not have to be this way. We've been forced to learn to live with the reality that gun violence can happen anywhere. We're concerned with shootings at schools, the grocery store, parades, places of worship, concerts, nightclubs, every and anywhere. Our homes are supposed to be our safe havens. Yet for many, it has become a place where terror reigns. Gun violence is present and safety is no longer a reality. If we can't be safe in our homes, where can we be safe? Domestic violence is common in every community, and it shouldn't be. It is insidious, and the likelihood of death increases when a gun is involved. However, we're here today because there is hope. Earlier this month, bills were introduced in the Michigan legislature to protect survivors of domestic violence from guns. Senate Bills 471 and 472 will prevent anyone convicted of domestic violence from purchasing or possessing firearms for 8 years after their sentence. This is common sense. If you're choosing violence in your home, threatening and intimidating your current or former intimate partner and or other family members, then you've proven that you can't be trusted with a gun. We all want our communities to be safe. The most dangerous time for a person who has experienced domestic violence is when they are attempting to leave and free themselves and their children from harm. We all want to protect families and to ensure that women and children who leave abusive households can do so and live. We can make that possible for survivors of domestic violence by passing those Senate Bills 471 and 472. Lisa?
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for inviting me today. My name is Lisa Geller. I am the Senior Advisor for Implementation at Johns Hopkins at our School of Public Health. I'm a researcher who's done research on the intersection of domestic violence and firearms. And my work every day is to keep people safe from gun violence in this country. But my passion is really preventing domestic violence and domestic violence with firearms. So the biggest problem on what I'm going to present to you today is that we don't have good data on this, which is, an issue that I think we can change. But a lot of the statistics that I have, and even research that I've done, there are some conflicts in what the numbers are. But what we know is that gun violence is a public health epidemic, domestic violence is a public health epidemic. And while I've seen different statistics for Michigan as to how many domestic violence homicides there are every year, I've seen 50, I've seen 100. What we know is that those are both likely undercounts, because this is such a pressing issue, and we don't always have the best data to show what a crisis this is, because some of these deaths go unreported, or they're reported in different counties, or they're not always classified as domestic violence homicides. So when I talk to groups, when I talk to people, when I meet with other researchers, we know that this problem is bigger than what the data shows. So I think a lot of people today will probably be talking about their own stories or talking about data both in Michigan and across the country. But I want us to keep in mind that this problem is bigger than what the numbers show, because of how oftentimes difficult it can be to get some of the data. But what we know generally is that about half of all women killed are killed by a current or former intimate partner. That does not mean that men are not impacted or other groups are not impacted by domestic violence, but women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence homicides, and male abusers are more likely to use firearms. And so it's critical that we talk about this picture in general, obviously not singling out non-women as victims, because they certainly can be, but talking about the burden that is often on women of color, when talking about domestic violence and domestic violence homicide more specifically. What we also know is that a woman is 5 times more likely to be killed when her abuser has access to a gun. So a lot of the work that I do is educating about the risks that firearms pose in these situations, especially in domestic violence situations, and highlighting the critical need to remove firearms from individuals who have histories of domestic violence. But my research also shows that this violence often leaves the home. It's not to say that we shouldn't pay attention to violence that occurs in the home. That's not at all what I'm saying. But I've done research on the intersection of domestic violence and mass shootings. And what we found was that about 2/3 of mass shootings in this country are related to domestic violence, either through the victims of those shootings being family or partners of the abuser, but also through a perpetrator's history of domestic violence. So when we're talking about gun violence broadly, there is often this connection to domestic violence. And domestic violence is often not taken seriously enough because it is viewed as private violence, or it is viewed as an issue that primarily affects women and women of color, groups that we know are not given the attention that they need when they are facing these public health crises and homicide crises. So that's all to say that we do have data here. I think the problem is bigger than what the data shows. But when we're talking about mass shootings, which of course represent a small percentage of gun violence broadly, we're still seeing that these public events that often capture the media attention, certainly more than the daily gun violence that we see, we're seeing that those large-scale events are also related to domestic violence and highlight the need for legislation that removes firearms from individuals with domestic violence histories. We know that a history of domestic violence is often the best predictor of future violence, or a history of violence broadly is the best predictor of future violence. And so we have a critical opportunity. We have this group that we've identified as a risk either to themselves in the form of suicide, and there is a connection between domestic violence and suicide, but also the relationship between domestic violence and histories of future violence. And so we absolutely need legislation. We absolutely need more attention paid to domestic violence outside of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is next month. And we need to take these acts seriously so that we can interrupt these cycles and not just react when there's a homicide or when there's a public mass shooting, but rather react at the first instance that there might be something wrong, because that's the public health approach. That's how we prevent acts, instead of just being responsive and trying to, mitigate things after a crisis has already occurred. We need to be proactive. We need to take that public health approach, and we need to protect people in Michigan. So I'm happy to stay on. I know we might do questions at the end, or but I know that there are a lot of other people here who need to speak. So I will end with that for now.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that information that is so relevant and so helpful. And my name is Celeste Kanpurwala. I use she, they pronouns. I'm the Michigan chapter leader of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. And I myself am a survivor both of domestic violence and of suicide. My dad took his life in 2014 after being abusive as I was growing up. And but I'm not here to talk about that today. I am here to introduce to you all an amazing advocate, a dear friend of mine by the name of Tanesha Ash-Shakoor. She has turned her story of pain into purpose. She founded an organization called Voices of Color, and it provides help and services for women who are going through domestic situations. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tanesha.
Thank you so much, Celeste, for that wonderful introduction. So just to go ahead and get started, a little bit about my testimony. It was in 2007, after graduating from undergrad, a friend who I consider a dear friend, we decided to move in together. I mean, I call myself helping someone out that just needed somewhere to go. And so in helping this friend out, after he moved in with me, we decided to enter into an exclusive relationship 3 months after moving in. During that time, it was the official title that changed everything for us. I started witnessing the verbal, mental, emotional, and the physical abuse, and it kept me on my toes. It was a way of things that I had never thought about. And I always give the example of how I used to love to vacuum my floors because you would get those nice, crisp, dark lines, and it always made your house look, nice and clean. But my abuser began to use that against me. And if he came home and those lines were lighter than typically would have been if they had been vacuumed, my footprints would then be accusations that I had been cheating and someone had been in our home. And so all of that began to just enhance everything that I was going through. And so now I was being raped by my abuser as a way to teach me lessons, as a way for me to admire and romantically never want someone and to just yearn for him. And so about 9 months in, he decided, for whatever reason, I remember him coming home. I was laying down. I don't even know what sparked him, but he immediately came to the room. And he just went berserk and started telling me that he was going to murder me that night. He kept repeating it. He kept repeating it. And I knew that he had access to a gun, which was in his truck. At the time, he didn't have it with him. But in the moment of sitting and listening to that, it was until he started saying, "I'm going to call my parents and tell them I'm going to kill you." And that sunk in very differently than him just saying it to me. And so he actually did that. He picked up the phone, he called his parents, and they didn't answer, but he said, "I'm going to keep calling until they know that tonight this is what I'm doing." And so I was held in the bedroom for over 3 hours with no one to save me in any sort of capacity because no one knew what was going on. And essentially, his parents knew, but I'm like, they're not answering the phone. And I knew no one else would listen. So I just cried. He strangled me several times and then released me when I thought life was over. So I continued to cry, continued to sit still and use every tactic that I knew that would work for me. And I just prepared that was going to be the night that my life was going to be over. And sadly to say, I was very much prepared because I was tired. I didn't have any more fight in me. So during that time, he reached out to a cousin that was really close to him, and she was able to convince him to put the knife down. And so I stand here or am on the Zoom right now to say I survived, but many don't get that chance to survive. And the essence of when you speak about, and I wasn't his first victim. I later found out he had been charged with a misdemeanor DV, and that was throwing a brick through her window. And as you see, me being the next victim, that definitely escalated, to the point now he possessed a gun and he was actually going to murder me, but he went on to become a police officer. And so when you think about that, this is the time that we have to listen. Maybe they didn't listen when I, was going through, but if you sit and you take a moment right now, each one of us on the Zoom right now has a pulse. And we are deserving of that. And I say that people who don't have a voice and who don't know how to come forward and share their truths and their transparency about what happened, they deserve that same opportunity to not live life in fear. And so I say to you, this is why it's so important to pass these bills, because I don't want anyone to have to experience what I have experienced, and knowing that I am living today, but I still live life in fear because he's in the streets and I don't know where he is. So I'm asking that leaders in Lansing, that you would please just listen to us, stand with us, and don't ignore our stories or our pain any longer, because they are real and it's time to take action now.
Tanesha, thank you so much for sharing your story and for taking that pain and turning it into advocacy and power, and trying to make sure that no one else has to go what you went through. Thank you. In answer to that call to be heard and to make changes to the law, I'd like to introduce Representative O'Neill, who's sponsoring the legislation we're here to talk about today. I could address some of these situations. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to all of you who are on the call, and to all of our victims of domestic violence. My heart just, every time I hear these stories, it just aches. So I'm here to support you and advocate for the passage of our legislation. I'll just like to read my information if I can, and then I'll be more direct to you. So often people who suffer from injustice, usually women, are asked to come forward and share their traumatizing experiences with us, which we just heard just now. And so I commend you for your courage and your tenacity to share and revisit the pain that you've experienced. It's not right that you have to bear the burden of your experiences and the responsibility to relieve and relive the worst moments in your life in public. There's no reason at all why someone convicted of domestic violence should own a gun. This has nothing to do with Second Amendment rights or anything like that. It's just wrong. We need to protect survivors. I'm committed to doing that and make sure that those survivors don't become victims. So that's why we're here today together all across Michigan. I was at a church locally today earlier, and we just kind of exercise our voices to advocate for domestic violence there. Calling on the legislators, my colleagues, we just had a hearing in the Senate on the 14th for Senate Bills 471 and 472. I do have the House Bills 4945 and 4946 that we will have a hearing soon on those. These bills are common sense. They just make good sense. He said, well, why do you care? I care because it's just the right thing to do. I'm a father of 3 daughters. I have granddaughters, and I want to be a strong advocate, not just for my daughters, but for all women and others who are victims of domestic violence. It's been proven in court, if it's been proven in court of law that a person is willing to violently abuse your family, then why should this person ever have access to a weapon? And we all know how hard it is to actually get these cases to court and even prosecuted. Michigan law prevents those convicted of a 2-year felony of domestic violence from purchasing or processing or having in possession a firearm. And we know that's not enough. So this bill says that anyone convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence of a 1-year felony of domestic violence is barred from purchasing or possessing a firearm for 8 years after the completion of their sentence. I think that's important. That means 8 years after jail or prison term is completed or any fines have been paid. Now, it's also important because we know that some abusers like to take advantage or come back to take advantage of the victims for them cooperating with the prosecutor directly after serving their sentence. And hopefully this cooling off period gives abusers time to reconsider their actions and rebuild their lives in a more responsible way. And it also gives survivors time to protect themselves. Together with the Extreme Risk Protection Order law, sometimes called red flag laws, these proposals also give survivors a much stronger protection. These bills have been heard in the Senate, as I indicated, on the 14th of this month, and now we need to have a floor vote. We're calling all my leaders and my colleagues in Lansing to follow the example of our Senate and move these bills forward as soon as possible. These bills have had bipartisan support in the past, and we believe that, again, they will have it in the future. So I'm calling on my legislators, Democrats and Republicans, to come together to protect our survivors in this community, across the state, and across this country. We can get this done with everybody's support. So I'm honored to be here and support you, and we stand right beside you.
Representative, thank you for your work. I'm confident with your leadership that we'll move these bills forward in the House very soon.
Yes,
Um,
thank you.
If folks in the press have questions, now is the time to ask. So if you raise your hand, I can call on you if there are any questions from the press. Not all at once. Yeah, Colin, go ahead.
Sorry,
Let us-
this is a bit more of a technical question, but I'm curious in terms of the existing law and the restrictions against felons carrying a firearm versus what this legislation would do. Because I saw in some of the communication around it, it was saying that current law, I guess, applies to 2-year felons. This would apply to misdemeanors and felonies. And restrict that to 8 years. So I was wondering, I guess, if you could just clarify a little bit in terms of what the current statute would do and the scope of this legislation.
Would you like to take that, Representative?
I'm sorry, I was distracted. You said what does this current law do?
Yeah. So sorry, this is a bit more of a technical question, because when I was looking through some of the communication around it, it was talking about how current state law restricts the ability of felons or certain felons from carrying a gun for however many years after their conviction. This bill, your bill, would loop in misdemeanors, prevent that for about 8 years. And when I was reading through the actual text of the bill, though, I was having a hard time seeing whether that would also apply to felons as well, that 8-year time period, or if that's a different part of state law that prescribes to that. So I was wondering if you kind of get into like the technical details about that, just to make sure I understand.
I see Lily's hand up to maybe she can give you the technical side of that. Lily.
Oh no, sorry. I just have a question after.
Oh, I'm sorry.
After Colin's
Sure.
done.
Well,
Go ahead, Representative. I can fill in if there's anything else.
I think the aspect of addressing it earlier, I think really adds another level of support and protection for our victims. To wait to have a felony, that means you've had multiple episodes of encounters with the victim, and so we already are responding after the fact, if you will, and in some cases we never hear about. So I believe that the misdemeanor, I mean, if it's a first or second offense, we need to let these individuals know that we're not going to tolerate that. That's just from my attitude. As I said, I'm a father of 3 daughters and I have 2 nice son-in-laws, but, if something were to happen, I want to know right away. And I'm sure others as well, your families want to know right away, so we can address this in a court of law and make sure these individuals are receive those orders and they're implemented. And that's another thing, to make sure we enforce the laws that are on the book, but also send a strong message. I think that's the key. If you do this, this is a serious issue. You need to get help to mitigate this cycle from reoccurring time after time. I mean, hearing a story from Tanesha, I mean, you know, you're just being a good person, you know, and this person has some issues based on you just being a good person. And so those kind of things I just think just sending the right message to our public that this is not going to be tolerated. We want to make sure that at the lowest level, you know, the lowest common denominator, we want to address it and not wait till you get a felony.
So just to make sure I understand correctly, this would be the 8 years after a sentence that would apply to both misdemeanors and felony convictions?
Yes, yes, it will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And it's both a expansion in terms of misdemeanors. Current law applies to 2-year felony domestic violence, but not 1-year felony domestic violence. So Representative O'Neill's laws would expand the pool of convictions this applies to more felonies and all misdemeanors.
All misdemeanors, right. Thank you.
Tanesha, I saw your hand. Did you want to chime in?
Yes, I did. I just wanted to point out just the significance of why, from a survivor perspective, but also as someone who goes to court consistently for DV cases, is to understand that it takes 3 misdemeanors, 3 convictions before it becomes a felony.
Right.
Typically, on top of that, we often go to court for a DV offense and it's pled down. So there are so many times that a domestic violence situation never is even charged as a domestic violence because they're allowed to plead that down to something else. Or when the report is, and it starts from the time the police show up, if it's not documented properly, or it's just a long cycle. So I encourage individuals who are just to really understand that this legislation is not just coming about because someone just wants to strip someone of their gun.
Right. Exactly.
It's essentially because when they process through the courts, the police reports are just as relevant. That process, they're typically not even charged with domestic violence. They have committed like crimes of domestic violence from hurting people and in various ways, even when it comes to property damage that may not even be listed under domestic violence. And so when I have caseloads of those who have been left for dead, whether shot or stabbed, and the courts don't even recognize it as domestic violence, that is why the misdemeanors, when we do have an opportunity for them to be charged under misdemeanors, it's critical that they too not have access to a weapon, because sometimes even a personal protection order, a judge may not check off the box and say they cannot have a weapon.
Good. That's good. Thank you for sharing that. Very good.
Thank you, Tanesha. I see Lily from Michigan Advance.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my question was just about the 8-year period of not being able to purchase or possess a firearm. Is there a reason it's 8 years? Is there any science behind that, any research, or is that more of a legal number? Just generally speaking, what makes 8 years a good metric for this?
Yeah, I know we work with every town, and Kathy Chang and the senator, we work through this process, and we felt that 8 year was a reasonable period of time, given the fact that we could have wanted longer, but it was palatable. We got support from the AG's office on that and other stakeholders to move this legislation forward. So, but I think just in general, as Tanesha said, I said this earlier at our event in town, that you know, the first thing I know when I'm going to get hit with, and I've had it already, you're trying to take away my Second Amendment rights. No, we're not. I'm a Second Amendment guy. I own many weapons. That's not the case. We don't want to have weapons in the hands of a perpetrator of domestic violence, because that already increases the risk of this person losing their lives. It's already been documented. It's common sense. It just makes common sense. It's not rocket science decision. And I think we have to be more practical and not the extreme when someone's tries to address an issue like this is so important that they just, whether it's left or right, you go to the extreme to say this is why you're doing it. No, we're saving lives. And that's the important part to remember. We want to save lives and keep families safe in all of this effort that we're trying to do. So that's the key that we want to understand. And responsible gun owners have it, which I want. But when you involve yourself in hurting a loved one, allegedly, or when you hurt your spouse or your significant other, if you got children around, they're seeing this. They're traumatized from this, and the impact of that is severe. And you may not diagnose that until they're in middle school or even high school or to become an adult themselves. And so, we just have to use common sense. It's not, again, jumping off the cliff and say, oh, wow, what problem are you trying to solve? We're trying to solve the problem of keeping families safe. Like just testimonies today. I mean, I heard some this morning. I mean, 2 victims, lost daughters, both of them. And then a grandson through domestic violence and suicide. These things can be prevented, and we have to hold our courts responsible too for, like Tanesha said, before you get to dealing with the main issues, you pleading down. If you got the felony here, you plead it down, and then we have to believe our victims. And that's another thing I've heard and I've seen. You tell the story and they want to blame you. That's not right. It's wrong. There's nothing right about it. And so, this is just another rung on the ladder to create an opportunity for us to, make sure these laws are enforced and make sure our courts are enforcing them, right? By listening and believing the victim the first time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you, Lily. Are there other questions? Okay. Well, with that, I'd like to thank our speakers, Cheree Thomas from the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence, Tanesha Ash-Shakoor from Voices of Color, Celeste Kanpurwala from Moms Demand Action, Lisa Geller from Johns Hopkins, and Representative Amos O'Neill of Saginaw. Thank you all for speaking out today, and thank you for your leadership.
Hey, Ryan, if you could make sure everyone on this call has my information. If they need to reach out to me, please, and that way, vice versa. If you could make sure that happens, I really appreciate it. So thank all of you.
Absolutely.
For your work and your commitment. And I'm honored to be a sponsor of this legislation.
Will do. Thank you very much, Representative. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.